Has the decoupling from China that the US government has been clamoring for since 2018 worked as expected? A report by two US economists a few days ago raised doubts. China is still embedded in the US supply chain. Bloomberg News quoted the report on August 26 as the title, pointing out that although the US has reduced direct imports from China, the redistribution through the industrial chain to third countries such as Vietnam and Mexico, however, the indirect supply chain connection between China and the United States is still intact, and even strengthened. The two authors of the 47-page report are Laura Alfaro, an economist at Harvard Business School, and David Shaw, an associate professor at Dartmouth College's Tuck School of Business. From the Trump administration to the Biden administration, the United States has continued to clamor for the decoupling of China's finance and investment, and the US Congress has also continuously concocted various bills threatening to impose financial sanctions on China. In 2018, the Trump administration launched a trade dispute, imposing tariffs on almost all Chinese goods. The succeeding Biden administration maintained the tariff policy, making many American companies prefer to bear the cost of industrial chain reconfiguration and began to shift imports to countries other than China. The Biden administration also provided huge subsidies in the Inflation Cutting Act and Chip and Science Act, trying to reshape production and procurement decisions in the U.S. supply chain. Since the beginning of this year, some foreign media have continued to hype the decline in China's exports to the United States, boasting that this is the result of the United States decoupling and breaking the chain. Bloomberg reported on August 8 that the latest data from the U.S. Department of Commerce showed that in the first 6 months of this year, the U.S. imported about $203 billion in goods from China, a 25% decrease from the same period in 2022. Mexico and Canada have replaced China as the America's largest supplier of goods. China has been the #1 supplier of goods to the United States for more than a decade, and the trade relationship between the two countries peaked last year, but the relationship is currently facing challenges as the U.S. is using nearshoring to encourage supply chain diversification. Nihon Keizai Shimbun stated that China and the United States, which account for 40% of the global economy, are divided under policy leadership, and the international trade structure is changing. The United States is importing more from its two neighbors, Mexico and Canada. Image source, Bloomberg. Similarly, the aforementioned report also documents a decrease in the share of U.S. imports from China between 2017 and 2022, with a corresponding increase in the share of imports from Vietnam and Mexico. Reuters quoted the report as saying that the two wrote that the US imposition of tariffs on Chinese goods, superimposed on its recently promulgated industrial policies and the new crown epidemic, did seem to trigger a great migration of supply chain activities. Direct purchases have decreased, from 21.6% of U.S. imports of Chinese goods in 2016 to 16.5% in 2022. At the same time, the import share of low-cost regions represented by Vietnam and nearshoring regions represented by Mexico is increasing. However, the decline in China's share of U.S. imports does not necessarily represent a real decoupling between China and the United States. The report noted that while Vietnam and Mexico's exports to the United States increased, China also intensified its trade and investment activities with Vietnam, Mexico, and other countries, and much of the trade volume seemed to be simply redistributed to third countries. Through trade and global value chain linkages with these third-party countries, the United States is likely to maintain indirect links with China. The 47-page report mentioned that both Vietnam and Mexico have close trade ties with the United States. Nearly a quarter of the former's exports are shipped to the United States. For the latter, the United States is its largest foreign market, absorbing nearly 80% of Mexico's exports. At the same time, trade links between Vietnam, Mexico, and China are gradually strengthening. Goods from China accounted for 9% of Vietnam's imports in 1994, and this proportion has surged to 26% in 2010 and 40% in 2022. The U.S. share of Vietnam's imports did grow between 2017 and 2022, but China's increase was even greater. For Mexico, the country's share of direct imports from China increases from 1% in 1994 to 15% in 2020 and 22% in 2022. Instead, Mexico's share of U.S. imports has fallen from 69% in 1994 to 44% in 2022. Between 2017 and 2022, China is the country with the largest increase in Mexico's import share. This trend is not limited to low and middle-income countries. The report pointed out that between 2017 and 2022, China's share in the EU's import market increased by nearly 2.7 percentage points, accounting for about 20.9% of total imports by 2022. In contrast, the United States accounted for about 11.9%, and only slightly increased over the same period. 0.4 percentage points. Through exports to these regions, China continues to be a player in the upstream stages of the U.S. supply chain. Bloomberg stated bluntly in the report that even though U.S. companies have taken measures to reduce direct imports from China, China is still an important part of the U.S. supply chain. Indirect U.S. supply chain ties to China remain intact. In some respects, through China's economic ties to Vietnam and Mexico, these indirect ties are even strengthening, the report reads. The study further pointed out that most of the U.S. attempt to stay away from Chinese goods was at the expense of U.S. interests. According to the two authors, the U.S. government's policy restrictions have changed the form of searching for goods, and even encouraged the transfer of domestic production, which has virtually increased the pressure on wages and costs in the United States. The report mentioned in the conclusion that it has been documented that almost all of the tariffs imposed on Chinese goods were borne by American buyers through price increases, but this did not bring significant offsetting benefits to the United States, such as improving the efficiency of American manufacturing weight. There are concerns that the costs of pursuing current U.S. industrial policy may be broader and greater than the public realizes.